Well, what's so interesting is this was a study done by the International Federation of Journalists, which is a union of journalist unions, which, you can imagine the meetings. But, you know, it gives them this funny bird's eye view into what's happening in more than 100 different countries, which you don't usually get. Like, what's happening in Guinea-Bissau right now? Like, who knows? And in terms of the media, and I think what they did was they kind of surveyed their members and found like, oh, that's weird. Like the same thing that's happening in Serbia is happening in Kenya, and that there was sort of not a kind of lockstep orchestrated push, but a obviously broad strategy to spend money, basically getting the Chinese, making connections between Chinese news sources and local media, really everywhere in every language. Like, that's what's so amazing. I mean, they're doing it in Serbian, and they're doing it in, all sorts of kind of in Portuguese, all sorts of places that we're not spending our time checking out what's happening in the local media in these markets.
Right.
So where do Chinese propaganda efforts echo American efforts, and where do they diverge?
Well, that's interesting. The Chinese point of view on this is what the U.S. does. This was Voice of America, things like that. And I actually think they're not that similar. The Chinese one is wrapped around to some large degree their Belt and Road strategy, which is this kind of debt and investment package where they're building infrastructure and making money off it, all over the world, but particularly in, very broadly speaking, in Asia and Africa. It's also not like this sort of intensely messaged propaganda. It's kind of a broad sense of like, we'd like to tell China's story. Not, I think, what you often imagine from an American perspective is that there's this like titanic struggle between freedom and communism, and the Chinese are out there telling everybody communism is great and America is bad. And if you look at the content, it's really not that.
We live in a world where social media platforms are playing an increasing role. And historically, America has held itself out as a country that was disproportionately, uniquely interested in protecting the privacy rights of its citizens in all of these kind of public-facing contexts. The rise of social media as public forums, as it were, has really drawn a lot of focus in more recent years as to how many freedoms are going to be protected there, because we don't have the same traditional expectations of privacy or the precedent in the form of law to protect our rights to speak there freely the way we do in more traditional public squares, sidewalks, national malls, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so now this move is part of a concerning trend towards surveillance in these spaces that, in essence, are the types that should allow the same kind of free speech protections. And the idea that the government is going to move closer and closer into this path of surveillance, warrantless surveillance without any cause, is a concern.
I think the salient point among many is that I am being prosecuted not by the U.S. government, but by Chevron. I mean, basically, the U.S. government, the SDNY, and the federal prosecutor here in New York refused to take up the charges when presented by the judge. And the judge then appointed a private law firm to prosecute me. They're being paid by taxpayer dollars, about $1 million so far on a misdemeanor. And it turns out that the law firm, Seward and Kissel, has a client relationship with none other than Chevron, the very company that I had crushed in court, along with a bunch of other lawyers down in Ecuador, in their preferred forum where they insisted the underlying trial be held. So all of this has led to this extraordinary situation where I was put on trial by this judge who charged me, prosecuted by an individual with direct financial links to Chevron. The main witnesses were Chevron lawyers. It turns out that a second Chevron law firm has spent millions of dollars bankrolling my private prosecution by using its lawyers to help the private prosecutors. And this is the first corporate prosecution in U.S. history. And frankly, I think it's terrifying what it means for our country. I mean, it's really a new corporate playbook that is designed to intimidate the heck out of lawyers and human rights defenders and campaigners, that is, people who take on the fossil fuel industry. So I'm in a difficult personal situation right now. I've been locked up in my home, by the way, on a misdemeanor for almost 2 years with an ankle bracelet. They're really targeting me, and it's Chevron, not the U.S. government, which is the scariest part.